I hit go live 3 times and it wouldn't go. So, I didn't write this up on the board, but I would like you to finish chapter 4. Please read, I've already said sections 3, so do sections 4.4, 4.5, and sometime I'm going to give a quiz. It'll be another one of those little 6 or like 8 questions. You guys did the quiz from last week, didn't you? Get 100? Do well on it? It's not meant to be that hard. And then the test will be over the weekend. I decided, did I say over the weekend? Next week. And this is philosophy. So sometime I'll put it on Teams, but I'll give you a few days to do it. So just do it when you get done reading. Sound good? And then we're going to do Alexander. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Alexander, but I'm trying to decide if I want to show that engineering empire. Because to be honest with you, I love it fascinates me, all the things they did for his conquest, the engineering for the wheel. So it's a little bit different style, and it covers it pretty good. And I think you guys like those shows. So if I do that, I'll post up the worksheet or tomorrow. Sound good? I kind of want to show it. I love watching it. That's the great thing about Western Civ in a class like this, where we can watch those kind of things. And there's only one more we'll watch for the rest of the year. Rome. Roman engineering, blow you away. And so that's my plan for the week. And then you'll just come back on Monday, finish up any loose ends, talk a little bit about the Hellenic world and Euclidean geometry. I know you want to talk to Euclidean, bring a Euclidean geometry, bring a straight edge and a ruler. We're going to do some intense math, and then the test on Tuesday, and then Rome. And for Rome, we actually have a couple, not a movie, but the BBC did they did 2 things. They're actually pretty remarkable. They're 5 1 hour, they're historically accurate, but they're all with professional actors, just really well acted. Special effects are amazing on 5 big events in Rome. So we'll watch a couple of those. And there's it's unreal how good they are, how well done. HBO and BBC, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, did a mini-series called Rome, a fictionalized one. And I watched it, it's pretty brutal, they had all that. It was just a fictional story. But they had all these great sets and everything. And so the BBC filmed these real accurate historical documents using all the sets and the extras for the battles for the mini-series for these historical dramas, and that's what I'll show you. And it's really cool. You will like them, right? And the Rome series is actually pretty good, but it's really hard. So we have to get critical approval, right? Got to bring it out all the qualifiers. All right. So we got the medicine. I think I did we went to the Peloponnesian War. Oh, who won the Peloponnesian War? Who? I heard it. Who? Yeah, Sparta won the Peloponnesian War. Sparta won. What place did Athens invade? Foolishly invade. What island? Yeah. Who was the guy who was a student of Socrates? I like how you said that. So that's what Alice Abates. I know I'm butchering the Greek language. I don't mean to. And then he would eventually join with the Persians. The Persians came back up. What decimated Athens during the... Wow. What decimated Athens when the war first started and Sparta surrounded? Yeah, some kind of plague. And I've seen various things. It could be typhoons, another one it could be. There's all kinds of stuff. Plagues are fun. Don't we know as we have our mask on? And so that reminds me, should I check the news and see how many cases there were? I'm kind of scared to know. It is crazy. The last poll I saw for the governor, the Senate, and the House are all basically talking.
Really?
Yeah. President Trump's only up by 5 or 6 points. I mean, that's,
Yeah, that's it.
he won by 20 in 2016. Oh, God. Sundays are usually almost none. 585 cases. I want this to end, but it's the new normal, at least for the rest of the foreseeable future. Did I begin hypocrisies in class? Does this sound familiar to you guys? Did you guys get this? Hippocrates and Hippocratic oath. Did I mention this at all? I think I didn't, did I? I couldn't remember exactly where I finished. We get to Herodotus, Thucydides, and that really kind of creepy picture. And Herodotus did the Persian War, also history of ancient Egypt. That map is pretty remarkable. And Thucydides, and this is the biggie, don't alter history. Try to be very pragmatic. Don't try to have history match your beliefs, because people do that all the time. You know, they have something, they want you to believe something about today. So they say, see, Thomas Jefferson said this. The founding fathers, that's a big one that people use in the U.S. The founding fathers were for this. And people will alter or change history. And that's it, hypocrisies. The city, I like that picture, even though because of the tiles, he looks like he has a massive, weird kind of beak for a nose, but whatever. And so we got the Peloponnesian War, this bloody, horrible war. And I mentioned all the 30 tyrants, and then eventually democracy we reestablished. Okay, so medicine. And the Greeks were actually pretty advanced in medicine. They did do some surgeries. They even did eye surgery, brain surgery. They set bones. They cut out cancers. Now let's be clear, they did have some things for to relieve pain, but for the most part it was grit your teeth and take it. Of course, then again, I guess if that was your expectation, this is a diagram of Greek surgical instruments, but mostly knives. And this would be used to, if you had to lance boils, you heat it up and then stab you with it. Oh yeah, I want to be clear about it. Just because it is a medicine did not make it actually medicine, not what you'd want to happen. There was a lot of bleeding. They used suction cups to pull out the disease, which people use that now. You see athletes who do that. They put suction cups on themselves. That will supposedly relieve muscle strain. So these men and women, I saw a bunch of volleyball players have that. These big pock marks on their in fact, one volleyball player, she had it all over her arms. They relieves pain. Hey, whatever works for you. I don't know, because I guess they're red hot. And they suck, and it sucks it out. That would hurt more, but hey, if it works for you. And the most famous of the doctors, one you probably heard of, was Hippocrates. And Hippocratic oath that all patients must be treated. And the idea is that we must treat and try to cure patients. Now, what do you do in the plague? They didn't really know, but this would have great influence for future doctors and set the stage for this idea. Now, to get an idea of what, they knew, he did some dissection, they did look at body parts, but it was pretty limited, and mostly digging up cadavers and looking at them, which, by the way, would become big business by the 15th century, digging up cadavers. That was to get into medical school, part of your payment was providing dead bodies. I'll let you ponder what could happen with that. Moving on. But the humors decided your diseases, and the 4 humors were blood, phlegm, yellow, and black bile. And so it had to be some kind of equality, some equilibrium between the 4 humors. And so blood we understand, phlegm, you know what phlegm is. That's another one I wish somebody was walking by and said, no, you guys know what phlegm is, right? Yellow-black bile, I think you probably can guess. Can you guess? Think about going to the bathroom. Okay, moving on, but also bile, they did a little bit of dissection. And so bile, especially when it with a little bit of blood, looked black. But this kind of some kind of equilibrium, and this idea would go on well into the 15th or 16th century, at least in Europe. Arab scientists would be so far ahead of European scientists. And then they had their own issues that led them to fall behind. You'll see this a lot. Somebody will be way ahead, and then they'll allow themselves to fall behind. Why don't you talk a little bit about this? We see with the Roman Empire, once you have vast inequalities of wealth, innovation kind of ends. Why? Because those on top don't want things to change because they like it the way it is. So, one other thing is all illness begins in the gut, which I could argue is probably kind of true. And so the idea is if you can cure what's inside you, so they would come up with all kinds of herbal remedies, some actually quite effective. They had something that was similar in a couple herbs put together, similar to aspirin. And aspirin itself would not be distilled until the 19th century. And so they were pretty far ahead of their time. And they would use things like this, but obviously not as concentrated. And the Hippocratic Oath was the first element of it was to do no harm. And so the idea is don't just try something on a patient like, I got a knife, let's see what's under the skin. Do no harm. There is a bit of papyrus with the Hippocratic Oath, but I know a lot of you are thinking, but I want to read the whole Hippocratic Oath, right? Who's with me? So here we go. And have this read. This will be on the test. Okay, the Greek alphabet's pretty cool. And I mentioned this in class the other day. Greek as a language, if you hear someone speak Greek, it's kind of a beautiful language. Even though I don't know, I had no idea what to say. English is a little bit like German, it's pretty. Italian is cool. French is pretty good. Spanish. Russian is amazing. Sounds good. Even if you don't know what they're saying, it sounds good. So, let's get to philosophy. And Greek philosophy would have such powerful influence. And the big element of Greek philosophy that is going to be from the Mycenaean era and go all the way through the Hellenic era and have great influence in the Roman period until everything would get blown up by the decline of the Roman Empire with the Sophists. And the Sophists believe that people must be taught. And here is the sage, it's probably Socrates, speaking to students. Teaching. And the idea is someone would teach a way and a method of thinking. And partially through rhetorical arguments and dialectics. And dialectics is like argument. Conflict. And the whole world is a conflict. Good versus evil, up and down, black and white. In fact, Thales of Ionia, remember way back when we were talking about the Phoenicians? And Thales we could figure out distance through using geometry. Thales, part of that early philosophy, very much influenced the Sophists, where the whole world is made of opposites. The whole world is made of opposites. And it is our duty to teach, and part of the teaching is through example. Teach why it's important, why it should be learned, to model that behavior. But a couple other things that come out of this. Truth and knowledge, according to Greek philosophy, is relative. It can be different for different people. And so it's going to be very difficult to find absolute truth. And this is actually going to be contradicted by a sophist named Socrates, who wanted to find absolute truth. But it is relative. What I see is different than what you see. And therefore we are subjective. So objective is right or wrong, this is the way it is. But the world doesn't come that way. We can have objective truths, but how we interpret them will be subjective. And that's another thing that the Sophists believe, that this very much fit with history. I can teach you truths and try to give you interpretations of what that meant. But it is your duty then to come up with your opinion and how you use that fact and that knowledge. It's up to you. It's subjective. And this is from the Pergamon Wall. And the Pergamon Wall was after Alexander. And Pergamon was a Greek city in what is now Turkey. And a beautiful, powerful city. And then the British stole, or the Germans stole it from the Turks. And now that's in the Berlin Museum. Remember that museum I showed you with the Babylonian walls? Same museum. In fact, the museum is called the Pergamon Museum. If I think about it, I want to go back. That was one that was really cool. So let's get to a couple of and one of the groups we'll get to just very quickly is Pythagoras. And we all know the Pythagorean theorem, right? All of you know but Pythagoras and his society, we don't know actually much about Pythagoras. This is a 16th century drawing of Pythagoras. And you notice there are men and women there. Men and women could join. They did have an idea of the equality of the sexes, this kind of philosophy where they want to look to the secrets of the universe, and they saw through numbers. Numbers and patterns. Triangles were almost a holy figure for them. The three-sided. In fact, 3 was to them like a magic number. And 3 could decide it all. That's why figuring out the length of an isosceles or a right triangle is such an important element of their thinking. To show that it is really a perfect triangle because this mathematical formula works. And Pythagoras also, they lived a communal lifestyle where they would learn kind of this almost mystical approach to numbers would lead us to a way to live better amongst themselves. And they tried to isolate themselves. They would not walk on the same roads as other people. They would not eat the same food. They grew beans, but beans were holy, and so they would not touch them. So here's Pythagoras growing the beans, but not like, no, we can't touch them. In fact, there's a story of a Pythagorean society, their meeting area, their communal house, and it's surrounded by beans, and a fire came and took the beans, the fire came around them and surrounded them, and the only way out was to go through their garden of beans. And since they could not touch holy beans, they all were burned to death. I know, beans are great. Of all things, beans. But a couple things they're best known for. I mean, they would, using numerology, they came up with better procedure, for example, to tune harps. Harps are all done mathematically, the length of the string, all mathematically proportional. And so here's a medieval drawing of using various harps or musical instruments that can be tuned with it using Pythagorean ideas. And there's, of course, the Pythagorean theorem with the 3 squares, meaning the 3 sides of the triangle, and that's where you come up with that theorem. And if you ever watched The Wizard of Oz, the scarecrow, when he gets his brain, supposedly says the Pythagorean theorem, but he actually doesn't. So the scarecrow is not very smart. Don't listen to because he mentioned the isosceles triangle. And that is a great painting by Raphael, one of my favorite Renaissance artists. I will do a day when we get to the Renaissance where we just look at paintings. I love paintings. I love Renaissance art. And so this is 16th century, but it's called the School of Athens. And there's Pythagoras. And what he did is he put Athens and all the great philosophers that influenced this wave of thought that was going through Europe during the Renaissance. And so there's Socrates, which we'll get to in a second. There's Plato, and there's Aristotle. Oh, and there's Raphael. He drew himself in his own painting. Great painting. This is in the Vatican Museum in Rome. The amount of wealth that the Vatican has just it will blow you away. This painting, the value is bigger than this wall, and it's It's immeasurable how much wealth is in there. How much is this painting is worth? It's one of the great paintings. Has anyone ever seen this painting? I love it. It's just, I'll give you a better copy of this pixelated one, but it's one of those you look at. Wow. So, let's get to these last philosophers. First one. Oh, almost forgot the Cynics. So the Cynics were starting just at the time of that golden age of Athens, when wealth was coming in the 5th century. The Cynics were sophists, but they had a different point of view. To the Cynics, and by the way, you've heard someone who is cynical. It's not quite the same. It's a little more than that. But a cynical, let's get to the value of it and we'll get into a definition. But antithesity, I want to say Thestes, Stennes. Antisthenes. He's actually relatively wealthy, and he came up to the conclusion that this was the path of immorality. Morality. And he stressed personal morality, so to have many followers. That was the idea that the only virtue that matters, the only thing that matters, is personal morality, your own strong moral values or virtues. And we'll come back to this. And so, what is the most important moral virtue? Avoidance of greed. To not be greedy, therefore take a vow of poverty. And so they would live on the streets, and here they are begging. Here's another one, begging on the sides of the streets, surrounded by dogs. We'll get to the dog part in a second. But that's what they'll be noticed by, long hair, living in the streets. And these Cynics would try to teach people the proper way, and you would be shocked how many people would follow them. And to this day, there are a couple of cults and special topics. I always do a unit on cults second semester, and there is a couple of cults that the people who live on the streets are still around today. We live in hell, so we don't see them, and this idea that as long as you're not greedy, you can therefore be credible as being virtuous. If you're greedy, and if all you care about is accumulating wealth, who should listen to you? Because all you care about is for your own personal gain. And so, they would attack the rich. And they start with, they would attack them like a dog. They would steal, grab at them, clutch at them, attack them like a dog. In fact, this is why people wealthy are being repulsed by them. Like a dog, aka canine, aka cynic. That's where it comes from, the term canine. And to a cynic, then, the main point about that is really for personal morality. And therefore take a vow of poverty because you're not credible as a real person if you're greedy. We think of a cynic today as they question people's motivations. Does that make sense? If you're a cynic, you're like, what are you really doing that? What do you want from me? And that's actually, I'm a little cynical. Sometimes it can be too cynical. But, because that can lead to negatively that you don't trust anybody. But it's like you have an ulterior motive. And one of the most important cynics was Socrates. Socrates would be in many ways a cynic. Not completely, but a cynic. So, Socrates. And Socrates, taking that same idea, is he thought he could find truths. He called it the universal. Now, isn't this a little bit different than what the sophists wanted? He took that same idea of the sophists and the great contribution of Greek philosophy and kind of turned it on its head and said, we can find the truth, but can everybody? Who's smart enough to find the truth? We get to that element here, but a couple things about it then. He wanted the inductive method. Using irony, wit. He called it the midwife technique. So a midwife helps childbirth. His technique was he would try to ask questions and ask to try to draw out of people the universal truth. Of course, many people thought he just was trying to humiliate you. To use his powerful use of rhetoric, which is argument, to humiliate. He's going to get a lot of enemies. Why are you asking me all this except to find contradictions in what I'm saying? And inductive means you think about it. You think. then what's deductive? Do. Experiment. And inductive and deductive. Descartes. But he always talked about how there's a lot of things that aren't true, or a lot of things that are inconsistent about people, but there's something, the universal, the nature of virtue. That there's something virtuous about people, if we can find it. Or virtue, maybe people don't have it. And therefore, what do we need to be? Thoughtful. Thoughtful in actions, thoughtful in how we discuss things, how we learn, being thoughtful. And so you would, the term, a close term to that would be by the 18th century, when you've all heard of it, would be an intellectual. To think about. Now that doesn't mean you're right, but you thought things through. And so you have a lot of pictures, and this is Socrates or a lot of statues of Socrates. This is a model of a Greek statue that has been redone in that style, but of him thinking. Of him thinking. You might have heard of a philosopher named Descartes. Okay, maybe. Have you ever heard the saying, I think, therefore I am? That's the same element that future philosophers looking back at Socrates. And what he believed also was, when it comes right down to it, what decides who we are? There's an inner voice. What do we call that inner voice? Yeah, your conscience. Your conscience. Your conscience. And that's what decides. And future thinkers are going to look at this. That's what liberty is. Liberty is freedom of conscience. You can decide for yourself what is right and wrong and what you do. You ultimately decide. It's not laws. It's not what people tell you to do. You make the decision if you obey. And that's what he's talking about here. Through your thoughtful action, your inner voice will decide whether or not you be virtuous. Will you be virtuous? And by the way, though, do you see the problem? If this decides will you be virtuous, what's virtuous? He kept thinking he could find this truth, but doesn't this fit in with the sophist? Isn't virtue kind of relative? Don't we all have a different point of view? My vision of virtuous is probably different than your vision. That's implying that I have a vision of virtue. So with that, therefore, if you have a society, who should lead? Because how many people are actually thoughtful? How many people actually listen to their inner voice? Or for that matter, remember what I said? Do I even know what virtue is? How many people are virtuous? How many? To a man like Socrates, who looked at people walking around, doing all these things, greedy. Remember, he was a cynic. All they care about is wealth or power. How many people can really lead? If you have a society, who should lead? Do you want the mob? So by definition, Socrates was anti-democratic. He did not like the idea that regular people had a voice. They weren't as smart as him. They weren't as virtuous. They weren't as good. Boy, this kind of brings nihilism or narcissism, I'm sorry. Nihilism is you don't like anything. You don't believe in anything. Narcissism. He's pretty arrogant, isn't he? You're not as smart as me. And so that's what he would teach his students. He would teach his students to find universal truth by asking people, but in reality, what he was doing is, he's telling his students to go and try to prove that they're smarter than the people they're interviewing. And so, that's how he's an interesting guy. Alcibiades, the same guy who convinced him to go to Syracuse, helped destroy the Greek democracy, led to the destruction, was one of his students. And trust me, when the Peloponnesian War ended, and they rebuilt Athens, and when they reestablished the democracy after the 30 tyrants that Sparta put in, they did not forget Socrates. Socrates, this guy who lived on the streets, he's a cynic. And even though he lived in relative luxury because he had some pretty wealthy students, there's a lot of contradictions here. And he would eventually, when the democracy was reestablished, they eventually convicted, tried, and executed him. Now they said for not accepting the Greek gods and corrupting the youth, but the real reason was that he was anti-democratic, and they still had forgiven him for Alcibiades. You're his teacher and you did it. But they couldn't say that. And so they had the big massive trial when the democracy was reestablished. And he basically defended himself. First off, he defended himself by saying, you guys don't know anything. And then he was going to be condemned to death. Well, being condemned to death, he had the right to make a statement. And so he could make a statement to save his life. And actually, a lot of people did not want him executed. He was 70. Even though he was anti-democratic, he had great fame across Athens, but his statement led him to no choice but to execute him. He said, I have done nothing but good. I deserve a large pension, not a potion. And so there's a painting of Socrates about to drink the hemlock. Because clearly it did not save his life. There's some people said he was very ill and he just wanted out. But there's him. He's making a statement wherever he drinks the hemlock. Which, by the way, drinking hemlock, this was meant to be more humane. It's a horrible, brutal, awful way to die. But that's how he died. But his student was a man named Plato. So Plato was son of one of the 30 tyrants, Socrates. And, this wasn't all supposed to come up. This was supposed to be clipped. Let me change it. So I go in order. So the 30 tyrants, that was the government right after the Peloponnesian War. And one of the leaders of it, who was considered one of the most brutal ones, who would have... God, that wind is just a killer. He'd be one of the most brutal of the tyrants. So when they reestablished the democracy, a lot of blamed on Plato. We're talking about what Plato was going to get the heck out of town. But Plato, that was the first time anybody would speak of Atlantis. Have you heard of Atlantis? And a lot of people believe the myth of Atlantis started with Crete and the Minoans. But that's where he was the first one to write and speak publicly about this great kingdom in the south called Atlantis. And a lot of people think he made it up, but it could have probably had something to do with the Cretes. But it appears like his idealized kingdom. So, he wrote his dialogues, which were a series of conversations he had with Socrates. And that's something we know anything about Socrates. And so what I just told you about Socrates, it might not be 100% true. Because almost certainly Plato wrote it to make himself look better. And he wanted people to think a certain thing about Socrates. And so they think a certain thing about Plato. And this goes against Thucydides, remember the historian who said you shouldn't do this? And this is exactly what Plato did. I would never do that. You would never do that, but there's people who do. By the way, you notice the statue kind of looks like Socrates. There's a lot of statues like this. Okay, so he got the heck out of town. He said that the city was too corrupt. But the reason he got out of town because the new democracy was mad at him and he didn't want to be drinking hemlock. And so he started his academy. And it'd be the first academy for learning for the sophists to meet outside of Rome. He bought an orchard and built it there. I don't know if they had holy beans, but maybe. Man, it would be there that he'd write his most famous work, The Republic. And in the Republic, he would lay down his most basic ideal for the perfect state. Ironically, not a republic. But, I know, it's kind of funny. By the way, where's the first republic being formed out of this time? Do you know? just across the Adriatic in Rome. The Republic. And yes, the U.S., we're a republic. So with that, it's very anti-democratic. Now remember, democratic means the people with power. But to his point of view, much like Socrates, at least he says Socrates said, that people don't know anything. This is by definition then classical conservatism. Okay, that term wouldn't come about until the early 19th century, but it means basically only certain people should rule. But to Plato, it should be like a philosopher king. So it's a king. So not a dictator. He wanted a king, so the king would have a greater connection to the state. Like the king is the state and therefore will want what's best for the people. But he wanted somebody who would be a thoughtful person. Remember what Socrates said? And think about what's best and most virtuous for society. Have you heard of Voltaire? We'll get to him, a French philosopher. Voltaire would say the same thing. You know, a philosopher king. And so like Frederick the Great of Prussia. The most famous person who said he was a philosopher king was Napoleon. And that should be pretty much all you need to know. That philosopher kings might not necessarily be really philosophers. And his army would be an army of lovers. That would be the best way to go. This has a little bit of a Spartan connection about young men would be under the wings of an older man. I'm not going to go into details of that. But the whole idea would be the men would all be lovers. And therefore they would fight harder because they wanted to defend their lovers. When you think about the difference between being heterosexual and homosexual in ancient Greece, that was not an issue. So the Romans were appalled by that. The Greeks were not. So that was his idea in the Republic. I've had to read this. I've read it for a philosophy class, and it's really hard to read. If you ever had to read one for a class, I'm just warning you. It's hard to read. It's interesting, but it's hard. But a few more things about it then. And this is a mosaic from, this I believe is from Pompeii. That was destroyed by a volcano. So, a couple things he said. First off, I don't know why I put another apostrophe there, but don't expect reality. The real world doesn't quite exist. What you think is real is not real. If everything is subjective, if everything is relative, what we see is a world of shadows. So we got to break through those shadows to find this perfect world, and we might never do it. That's why he left the corrupting influence of the city. He claimed. Yes, and do not drink hemlock. But also he didn't want to be around those smelly, stinky, regular people. One more thing about the bell rings. Ideal. So the ideal is perfect. It's perfect. You don't need to change it. There's no change there. It's ideal. Why would it ever change? Yeah. Doesn't the world change all the time? That's imperfect. And so we got this imperfect world. But what we're striving for is this knowledge of the perfect. Which then there's no change. This will have a great influence on future things. And we have just a little bit left to finish tomorrow. That will be in the class tomorrow. And then Alexander. And so I'm going to talk just a little bit about Alexander. A couple stories. I might tell you one story about the Spartans, how they finally were defeated. They were routed by the Thebans. I know, the Thebans. So they were routed by the Thebans, and then they'd be in decline. Anybody want to guess how the Thebans did it? Here's two battle lines. This is us, this is them. They put all their best forces here. And they acted like they're attacking here and smashed the flank. Doesn't seem that complicated. It was revolutionary in 400. I will see you next week, right when you find work. And hang by your thumbs. Now I got to get another video started. That's all I do is start videos. All right, we are done. Good.
The last classroom was so hot.
What classroom is that?